100,000,000,000 kalpas. Now I can see and hear it, accept and maintain it. May we unfold the meaning of the Tathagata's truth. All right, good morning everybody. Thanks for a beautiful ceremony this morning and nice sitting. I want to start out by saying, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Zen master, he says that the next Buddha will not be a person. The next Buddha will be the Sangha. And you guys are it, right? The Sangha. The Sangha is the Buddha. In this talk, I'd like to talk about continue to talk about the 8 points for optimizing our meditation practice, optimizing our Zazen, our seated meditation. And this is the 7th point, so we've been gradually moving through all of these points about how we can actually improve our sitting experience. And this point has to do with Sesshin. So what I'd like to share in this brief talk is what the meaning of Sesshin is. That's the first thing. The second thing is about ego dissolution, dissolving the ego. And the third thing is learning the Dharma. All right. So the first point is, first of all, what is Sesshin? What is the meaning of Sesshin? What is it? So I'd like to, first of all, describe Sesshin. And I'd like to do so by opening with the thought that the Buddha himself was a human being, not a god. The Buddha was a human being. And because he was a human being like you and I, he knew firsthand and understood what it means to suffer, what it means to suffer as a human being. And if we go to practice with our suffering, the suffering that resides in our heart, if we go to practice acknowledging that we suffer, then we'll be able to connect with the Buddha. The very first koan in the Gateless Gate, Mumonkan, is about mu, or what's been translated as emptiness, or what Thich Nhat Hanh translated as interbeing. And in that koan, it says that if you could enter mu, or interbeing, if you can enter interbeing, then you will walk hand in hand with all of the Buddhas and all of the ancestors. And as a society, generally speaking, we are highly influenced by this idea of individualism. And that gets translated sometimes incorrectly in our sitting practice as just be. Or what do we do in Zazen? We're practicing being. But that is not, that word being, yes, it's true that we're being, right? We're simply being. But it's not complete. And I think Thich Nhat Hanh's word interbeing is actually more helpful for us, that we don't just be, we interbe. And if we can enter into interbeing, we won't be alone. That sense of isolation, of aloneness will scatter. So what does Sesshin mean? Sesshin, first of all, Sesshin means, the word means to touch the heart, right? To touch the heart. And in a sense, it is the Zen Buddhist form of Sabbath, of taking time out for yourself and really touching the heart, allowing the heart to rest deeply in interbeing, allowing the heart to rest deeply in its interconnectedness, in its interwovenness with the entire fabric of reality, and to contemplate that. To contemplate that and to soak it up physically, not just intellectually, but also physically, to feel that sense of belonging to the fabric of all reality. And so there's many ways to do that. Some of you have practiced that for, say, a week-long Sesshin, 7 or maybe 8 days, like what we sometimes do for Rohatsu Sesshin, where we commemorate the Buddha's enlightenment. But a lot of us, given our busy schedules, can't take out 8 days out of a whole year to do that kind of sitting practice. And so we also have 2.5 days, like we often do here. We just started back again with Nebraska Zen Center, doing every other month, Sesshin, 2.5 days, starting Friday afternoon, going to Sunday afternoon. So, but you don't have, and even sometimes a whole weekend is difficult to do, but we also do half-day sittings, we do full-day sittings. So if you could even take out a half a day or a full day from your schedule to experience a Sabbath in the Zen way of doing that. It's really, really nourishing. It's really, really nourishing. To touch the heart, though, this Sesshin, to touch the heart is not for the faint of heart. Just want to make that clear. This is not an easy practice. Sesshin, in fact, will test us. Sesshin will test our practice. So and for those of you who are not experienced with Sesshin, have had a little bit of meditation practice, I would encourage you all, or even if you've done Sesshin practice, it's always good to come back to Sesshin. But especially those who have not had a lot of sitting practice, maybe just beginning, to have a half-day sitting or to have a full-day sitting practice really helps to deepen our awareness, deepen our understanding of what our practice is about, through deepening our sense of presence, our sense of conscious awareness of ourself, but also of our surroundings, and our sense of belonging to that fabric of reality. Sesshin is the place where words and ideas really become futile. They don't have much ground to stand on if you continue with the Sesshin practice. So that's my intro to what is Sesshin. And I think many of you already know, those of you who have done a Sesshin practice, whether for a day or a full week, you guys know what I'm talking about here. And at the end of this talk, I'd love to hear more input from others about Sesshin, those of you who have experienced it. Okay, so number 2, ego dissolution. This is the second part of this talk, is what we inevitably experience is ego dissolution. So what does that mean? We have to be really careful to not underestimate the sway or the power that our thoughts have on us. They bind us up with our ego. Our ego is tightly bound to our thoughts. So if we said, this is who I am and these are my thoughts, they're completely, in our preset Sesshin self, pre-meditation self, sense of self as usual is not disconnected from our thoughts of who we are. They're completely interwoven. We bind up our sense of self with who we think we are, with our thoughts. And one of the ways that not all by any means, but one of the ways that gets bound up is with our sense of identity. So when we say, I am a, fill in the blank there, I am a Buddhist priest, that's an identity. And we create a sense of self out of that identity. And what the ongoing sitting experience does when we continue to let go of thought, and even without our efforts, when we're really sitting day after day after day, or hour after hour after hour, those thoughts about who we are really, it's like some kind of a acid to a what am I trying to say here? So it's like cleaning up the thoughts, and the thoughts dissolve, like how acid dissolves things up. That's what's kind of happening during Sesshin. It's just dissolving up our thoughts without our effort, other than through committing to stay in one place and sit and watch the mind. That's key, is watching the mind. So now the self starts to disentangle itself from thought. And so here's the self and here's thought. And now we're watching the thoughts over here. They're no longer like this, or they're slowly getting disentangled. And now we see, oh, these are my thoughts over here, and this is me. They're not the same. They're not the same. I still exist without thought, right? But this is a very difficult experience for many of us. For some of us, this might be total bliss land. This might feel so compassionate, right? This might be where our compassion really springs up. And that's really, I think, the intention of this disentangling of our thoughts. But that's often not the experience, especially when we're first starting out or new to meditation, or even if we've been sitting for a while, that might not be the experience. This disentangling of thoughts might come with a lot of anxiety. It might come with a lot of anger. It might come with a lot of physical pain. And so it's helpful to know, like, what's the bigger context in which we're sitting in? Why do I feel disoriented when this decoupling of thoughts takes place during an intensive meditation experience? Why do I feel disoriented? Why don't I feel whole? Why do I feel maybe a lot of fear or anxiety? There's maybe a number of answers to those questions, but one that I'd like us to maybe think about comes from the philosopher Descartes. Descartes was very influential. Whether we understand his philosophy or not, he was very influential for the way that modern Westerners think of themselves. He said, I think, therefore I am. Now, in his day, that was a huge statement to say, I think, therefore I am. Right? It was a coupling of thoughts with a sense of self. And it also created this dualism between human beings that he thought think versus non-human beings that don't think. It created this kind of a dualism. And we modern people, without being conscious of it, we have accepted that way, that particular philosophy over the past couple hundred years. And that influences how we perceive what's happening in our meditation. And so it's helpful to know, like right from the start, okay, we suffer as a society, we suffer from this kind of way of thinking about the self that is identified with thought. I think, therefore I am. And so what happens in our minds, what's happening is when we decouple thoughts, it's a kind of like a dying experience if we're coming at it from this unconscious way of thinking of I think, therefore I am. To decouple from our thoughts is to not exist, in a sense, right? If we wholeheartedly embraced, unconsciously, if we wholeheartedly embrace this idea of I think, therefore I am, then to decouple from our thoughts is a frightening, scary experience, creating a lot of anxiety. So that's the dissolution of ego. Now, for some people, though, for some of us, that can be a very deep feeling of love. This dissolution of ego can be come with it a very deep feeling of peace, of inner peace, a very deep feeling of our connectedness, of our interbeing with all of life. It can accompany that as well. That can accompany us too. But point 3 here of this talk, the last point I want to make, is that we can facilitate this sense of compassion, of love, of interbeing by way of continuing to study the Dharma. Right? So Dogen says to study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self, right? So the second point is about forgetting the self. The third point, he says, to forget the self is to be one with the myriad things. So, okay, well, the question is, if we're suffering, how do we end suffering, right? If we're at Sesshin, touching the heart, if we're touching the heart, there is an acknowledgement that there's suffering going on in our life. There's some acknowledgement there, right? And Sesshin is to address that suffering, to help. And so how do we do that? How do we do that? The key is to learn the Dharma. To learn. I don't mean just study it. Yeah, it's good to study it with the intellect up here, but to learn it. How do we learn it? We learn it through things like Dharma talks, right? Call it watering the seeds of the Dharma. So you hear a Dharma talk. And the Dharma talk can help that rain of the Dharma to penetrate the heart so that the Dharma starts to take root in our heart, right? In our heart. So through Dharma talks, through chanting, right? The Faith and Mind Sutra that we just chanted here is Dharma, and we're chanting that Dharma. Reading the Dharma, just plain reading. Pick up a Dharmic text, pick up a sutra and read it, or pick up commentaries on the sutras and read it and study, right? And the other thing I want to mention is to teach ourself the Dharma. Teach ourself the Dharma. It's nice to hear the Dharma being proclaimed by a teacher or reading about it, but you can also teach yourself the Dharma, right? So because the teacher is you. The next Buddha is the Sangha, right? And so as a Sangha member, you have that power in you. You have the Buddha in you. If you touch your heart and you're suffering, you're connected with the Buddha. The Buddha was a human being. The Buddha suffered just like we do. You have Buddha inside of you. You have that awakened nature inside of you. You have that compassion, that love inside of you. You can teach yourself the Dharma too. Regardless, we've all made mistakes. None of us are perfect. Just like Faith and Mind says, when you dissolve that dualistic mind, we don't worry about our imperfections. you have the capacity to teach the Dharma to yourself too. And you can do that while you're silently sitting. While you feel it, like, what is that? When you're sitting in Zazen, you can ask yourself, what's the Dharma right now? What is the Dharma teaching me? Right? You have a unique take on the Dharma, and your whole soul wants to hear that Dharma talk while you're sitting. You have a Dharma talk inside of you. Each of you do. So you can, for example, you can remember verses of a sutra that are meaningful to you. You don't have to know the whole sutra. Just one line, just a single verse can be very powerful. And if you do that while sitting, that can open up your Zazen experience. The other thing to keep in mind in this third point about studying the Dharma is that the emphasis in Sesshin is not necessarily on well-being. Right? The emphasis is not necessarily on our personal well-being. Well-being may or may not come as a byproduct of Sesshin, and well-being will appear and disappear. Sometimes it manifests itself, and sometimes it disappears. So it's not a good gauge to ask ourselves if I'm, feeling okay. Is not necessarily a good gauge for determining the success of Sesshin. So you might ask, well, why bother doing a Sesshin if it doesn't help me to feel better? And I would answer, it's to see that we don't end at our skin. That was one of the first things that my teacher taught me, and it wasn't inside of a Sesshin, but when she was teaching meditation, she said, we don't end at our skin. Right? This is something that this is what Sesshin is about. And people have all kinds, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, those of you who have had some deep experiences in Sesshin about us not ending at our skin. If you sit long enough, you'll have some pretty profound and deep experiences of letting go of self, but in a sense that, you really feel this sense of interconnectedness with life. And what Sesshin does, this touching of the heart, it aids us in extending our consciousness into the material world, into the physical world. We don't just identify with other humans, but we also come to identify with the more than humans, or the non-human people, as indigenous peoples would refer to the natural world, the non-human peoples. Right? The butterflies, the grasses, the trees, the plants, the animals, all of them, the birds. Right? Can we hear the birds outside preaching the Dharma when they're chirping away, or the wind preaching the Dharma? To forget the self is to be one with the myriad things. To be one with the myriad things is to realize no barrier between self and other. Right? This is Dogen's core teaching, to realize no barrier between self and other, this non-dualism. All right. Thank you. So at this time, I'd love to hear your what your experience, if you want to add to this, if you've had experience of Sesshin, what keeps you coming back? And, I don't have a specific question, but maybe some of the things I've shared resonate with some of you, or you want to, inspires you to share something with us to encourage those that haven't necessarily done a longer sitting period to perhaps think about it. All right, and I know we all have we have limited capacities to how much time we can devote to our formal practice. So I don't want anyone to be discouraged if they're not able to do more than, say, like a Sunday morning like we're doing now. That's totally fine. but just to plant some seeds, right? Because you never know how our life changes and how, you know, things shift, and we can reprioritize things. All right. Thank you all so much.